Okay, hi everyone. I'm just like to welcome everyone to this webinar entitled "We Need to Talk About AI" and run here by the LIR Group. Just to say it's been recorded, so we will make the recording available afterwards. And just before we get started and for our kind of running order of speakers, I'll just give just a couple of minutes just to look, or I'll just say a few thank yous and a few little bits and pieces first. You know, you're not here, as I know, to hear me talk, and certainly not about AI, or you would be gravely disappointed. But like a lot of people here, I guess one of our reasons for organizing this talk is that a lot of us in many respects are kind of, I heard the word mentioned before, grappling or trying to grasp some idea around AI. Something that has been around for quite some time, but I guess has a recent spotlight thrown on it, and certainly making a lot of sensational headlines and discussions around university campuses, in the media, etc. But just in terms of a few thank yous first, and just to say the running order, we're going to have Andrew Cox speak first, then Francis, and then Thomas. If you have any questions, if you can pop them into the Q&A, so you'll see a Q&A just here. And what we'll do at the very end is that we'll run through the questions, and then the panel can jump in and answer any of those questions. But maybe if you want to just put in a kind of, you know, if it's specifically for Andrew or for Francis or Thomas, if to put that in the question as well. And I just realized I didn't introduce myself. Sorry, my name is James Malloy. I'm a college liaison librarian in University College Dublin, and I'm going to chair the event. So I just a quick few thank yous to thank all the LIR Group committee, and also to thank in particular Siobhan, Ken, and Anya in terms of getting this up and running. It did take us a few months, and we were very aware that, you know, even in that short space of time, things are moving in this kind of world in around generative AI and machine learning and all the kind of sort of said the headlines and so on. But I do also want to say we're due to finish at 1 o'clock. However, if the questions continue on a little bit further, and then we will let the clock run a little bit above that. But if people need to go at 1 o'clock, then that's absolutely fine. That's okay. Before I introduce Andrew, I just want to cast your minds back to a particular date, which is the 30th of November 2022, and a few significant things on that day in particular. One, for me, it was my birthday. Yes, thank you very much. And if you want to make note in your diaries for this year, please do. For LIR Group, we ran our annual seminar. So we were actually having a seminar talking about cybersecurity and in libraries. And so yes, I guess, you know, we were busy involved in that kind of area, and yet there was one other significant thing. Oh yes, I remember it now. Yes, ChatGPT, or as we know it, was launched by OpenAI, and you know, this is their kind of tagline was optimized for dialogue, and it was a sibling model to instruct GPT. That's my kind of understanding of it. And I guess now, Thomas, I just look back to your Twitter before, you know, that really things were happening, but not necessarily, the media hadn't really kind of jumped in there at any stage, not until the new year, effectively. And now it's kind of on a daily basis where we're hearing headlines about, you know, ChatGPT and generative AI and about machine learning. Some good, some bad in a way, some sensationalist, you know, and including sort of, you know, we're at the end of mankind, which is fantastic coming out of a pandemic and rising sea levels and everything else. But here today, we're really to talk about the practical stuff in many respects around the impact on libraries. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Andrew Cox. Andrew is Senior Lecturer in Information School in the University of Sheffield, and is currently the convener of the IFLA AI SIG and the Chair-elect of the ASIST SIG on AI. And he's going to look at the impact of AI on libraries, which is a follow-on from a keynote that Andrew gave to us back in 2019 at the LIR seminar, which was around the impact of AI on academic libraries. So we have been here before, so this is, you know, in many respects, it kind of shows where the LIR Group is in terms of the thinking around this. So Andrew, take it away.
Thanks so much, James, and thanks to the group for inviting me to give the talk, and Thanks to everyone for coming along today. So I'll just share my screen. So hopefully you can see that. So I'm from the Information School of Sheffield. What I was going to say a little bit about today in the 20 minutes I've got is, first of all, say something about what I think AI is. Second,
sorry, Andrew, your screen there isn't shared. Sorry.
Is it not shared? Okay. Sorry.
No, that's
better. Yes. So, okay. So what I was planning to talk about is, first of all, try and say what I think AI is. I'm sure other people can give a much more formal or technical definition, but try and say something about that. Especially differentiating between maybe descriptive and generative AI. Also say something about how libraries can use AI or are using AI, and then something about what a strategic response might look like. James has already said something about this, so I know these are UK headlines, but I've got a feeling you're seeing something similar in the Irish press too. So we've got the Independent saying, you know, AI creators are fearing the extinction of humanity. And more specifically, I think this was over a couple of days, we had the headline on the Times, which was a letter from educational leaders saying that AI is a threat to education. We had the British Prime Minister sort of acknowledging the need to regulate AI. And this is an interesting headline from obviously a right-wing newspaper, sort of saying, is this the start of the great AI jobs bloodbath? And the trigger for this was some layoffs by BT of technology workers. So there's a lot of fear revolving around AI. Also a lot of positive news. Guardian's covered this topic pretty intensively, but one of the news stories about at the same time was AI discovering a new antibiotic to treat a deadly superbug. So there seems to be a lot of interest in this topic. It's not often that our stuff, like information, gets to the news headlines, but this is a case where it is. But on the whole, at the moment, ChatGPT and the like seems to have stimulated quite a negative, fearful reaction. But this isn't that new, because we've been hearing about the dystopias and utopias related to AI for 100 years, at least, in terms of, you know, movies. Some of the earliest movies there are about kind of robotic forms, and indeed on the right hand corner there I've got reference to Talos, which was in Greek mythology some sort of robotic being that protected Crete. And there's quite a lot of stories about Daedalus and some of the gods creating animate forms. So it's not something that's totally new. While it's changing before our very eyes of what AI means, it's not really new. It's something that we've kind of been preoccupied culturally with. So what is AI exactly? Well, we can look at formal definitions. I've copied a few here, and they tend to revolve around the idea that a computer is going to do something that we would normally expect a human applying intelligence to do. Interesting that it's to replace intelligence, not all the things that humans can do. It's about intelligence, but that has been critiqued. I particularly like the UNESCO one because it says it's about machines imitating some features of human intelligence. Well, it doesn't really take us that far to understand what AI actually is. We could look at the technologies. I'm not really qualified to describe all these technologies, but we know it's something to do with all these very powerful technologies like natural language processing to turn speech into text, or text into speech, or computer vision to kind of analyze images and or based on machine learning, computer learning to see patterns in data. Of course, we could focus on technical definition, quite a lot of people would, but I think we shouldn't ignore the politics of the power behind these technologies. If we want to get a more practical idea of what these technologies are about, I would recommend to just explore AI, which is just like a playground with different tools, and the increasing number of sort of applications spinning off ChatGPT. There's quite a good link there to a lot of apps that are emerging around that. Maybe it's more useful to remind ourselves that a lot of AI stuff we're relatively familiar with. So maybe not everyone would agree with this definition, but a lot of the things we're seeing in our everyday lives, like spam filtering, recommendation, translation tools, and all the stuff about, say, even in this webinar, we could have had captioning. It's not 100% efficient, but it could deliver some sort of useful transcription of what's being said. These are, as far as I'm concerned, hints of what AI is about, versions of AI. I mean, predictive text we've had for years. When I write a Google document, in my institution we use Google. When I write an email, it's always trying to tell me what I'm going to say. And ChatGPT is just an extension of that. So I think we shouldn't start from the assumption we know nothing about this. And I would say, perhaps, though, we could acknowledge two different types of AI now as kind of important to us. So here's a very simple example, a kind of made-up example of what the old face, if I can dare to call it that, of AI in libraries might have looked like, descriptive AI. So suppose someone donates to your collection 10,000 video files, and all you've got is the titles of each video. It's not realistic we're going to go through all of them and manually enhance what's in those videos to sort of say, oh, you know, who's talking about what and so forth. Not really realistic to do that unless you've got lots of money. Whereas AI is going to just refer to the idea of captioning. So AI could offer some sort of voice recognition, provide some sort of transcript of what people say in these videos, and that would provide some sort of crude search. Probably it's not that accurate, but it's good enough to help you navigate that content quite well. Also, it could use image recognition to identify types of objects. So maybe there's, I don't know, some of these videos are about, I don't know, a particular city. It can recognize modern objects like cars and houses, probably, depending on how it's been trained. It might even recognize a specific place. It might recognize Dublin if it had been trained with the right images, recognize particular people. It could even, and that would again give you some way to provide a much better search of that content than you could ever practically do without loads of resources manually. Could even do some strange things. Perhaps it could identify music that's running in the background of the videos, and that might enable some sort of search that you would want people to do. Of course, so that's probably what we would think of up until ChatGPT came along, with what AI is and how it's highly relevant to libraries. So obviously this is kind of making access to information, knowledge easier. Of course, it's not 100% accurate, but for search, it probably doesn't really matter. It might be a little bit hard to explain to the user how this thing works, where this data's come from, how to make sense of search results. That might be a problem. There certainly might be a bias issue. So suppose it's doing voice recognition. Chances are it might have been trained on the majority voice, which is probably, we might say, English people speaking English. Is it going to understand someone with a strong accent, a local accent, a Yorkshire accent, an Irish accent? Is it going to understand Irish language? And so I think if we're looking at like heritage collections, which a lot of times we are with libraries, it's the majority voice that would be more heard in those, more accurately captured in that kind of indexing. And that's a problem for us, because I think in heritage collections, we more and more want to hear minoritized voices, the voices that aren't heard enough, people speaking local accents, people speaking Irish. So we've got to think about, and that's not to do with the bias in AI, really, it's about the bias in the training data we use to train the model to understand what people are saying. The other big barrier, I think, for this kind of application probably is a balance between skills and costs. So I know some people in the AI SIG, if AI SIG, think, oh, well, this is all, we can build all this stuff on open source systems. Maybe you can, but you've got to have high level of skill to do that. So we probably, most libraries in the UK, and maybe true in Ireland too, have focused on other things than technical skill. So we're good at certain things like promoting information literacy, but perhaps not focused on developing our own systems. So we've got limited in-house development capability. So I'm not sure that building our own systems is likely. And the skills to build these things is kind of very high demand at the moment. So can we compete for those people to do that? Versus, okay, so we're going to have to buy the systems, but the systems are expensive. So I think this is a big issue for us in this kind of the old face of AI, as I've just called it. Also, new face of AI we've already sort of referred to is things like ChatGPT and the variants on it. And this is like being a bit astonishing to everybody, because it's maybe a form of general AI in the sense that it can write all sorts of things. It can write code, can solve maths problems. Maybe it's offering a new paradigm of how to search, where instead of getting a load of research results back, we get an answer. That could be the strongest impact on the library world of this kind of technology, is like expectations about search results change. But also kind of a lot of ethical and information challenges actually about ChatGPT. I made a list here of some of the key issues. I'm not going to go through all of them, but we know, everybody knows by now, that it hallucinates information, it can make stuff up, it can even fabricate citations. Generally, it doesn't give references, so you can't really check the information you're given by ChatGPT. You can't cite it because it doesn't currently produce a persistent output. If you ask the same question again, you get a different answer. It's almost certainly also somewhat biased, given the data it was trained on, which is about, to a large extent, things like Reddit and the open internet. These have got biases in, so almost certainly we know GPT as a whole has got biases. And we can also say there's a problem here around just accelerating content creation. This is something that I suppose in our profession we've kind of encountered a lot. It's like the amount of information being churned out is just going to accelerate with these kind of tools. So there's a lot of information challenges tied up with ChatGPT, and in a way that's a gift to us, because it's obvious that in terms of information literacy, we need to get people thinking about the information quality of these sources. There's also quite a lot of ethical issues, not just the ones I've mentioned, including about how ChatGPT was created in terms of exploitation, environmental sustainability, the disruptive power of big companies. I'm not going to dwell on this because I think Thomas is probably better qualified to sort of talk about, so what are the questions we should be getting users to ask when they look at something like ChatGPT. This is my sort of summary of like, well, learn to use it effectively. Think about, is it helping you learn? Make sure you protect your privacy, because A lot of companies have banned ChatGPT for confidentiality issues. Ask who owns and develops and profits from it, and ultimately use it ethically. What are the local rules about how you can use it, and acknowledge its use appropriately. There are ways to decide using ChatGPT. I just want to quickly say also, I mean, I think we should also be thinking about what's next, and that's likely to be things like Copilot, which is Microsoft's putting ChatGPT in the Office suite. So it can do things like create a report, or claims to be able to create a report, create a presentation from a report, do initial analysis of data and explain the analysis, summarize meetings. So these things are going to become part of our everyday working lives, particularly any form of office work, I would say. But there's lots of, again, information issues. I haven't really got time to go through fully, but I think for us as information professionals, we've got relevant questions that we could ask about these types of tools. So a balanced response, I think we can be pessimistic because of the bias and potential impact on social equality of these tools, and the potential for things like ChatGPT just undermine, creating more deepfakes, creating more misinformation, disinformation, and generally content overload. And there's also this kind of looming danger of the power of technology companies we've got to resist. On the other hand, we can see that AI has benefits in terms of access to knowledge. It's making information creation easier. So ChatGPT does seem to help people break through a mental block when they're writing, those kind of things. It's got, and it's got a lot of good uses. There is a potential for regulation, and ultimately, I suppose, it's creating a role for us to sort of explain the information dangers and the ethical dangers. This is part of a wider picture. So I suppose that this is an attempt to summarize all the impacts of AI across library work. So I don't think it's just confined to say the way that generative AI can do things around personal productivity as knowledge workers, like summarization, translation. Those are really powerful uses, but also we can have chatbot services in libraries. I believe there's quite a big role for libraries in terms of supporting emerging data science communities to manage data and so forth. So I think there's a lot of ways AI will touch library work. It may be a wide and deep impact. And I just want to quickly close, because I'm aware I'm just talking too much. Again, sorry, these are UK references mostly, but while AI is like a puzzle to us all, we're all grappling with it, as James said at the beginning. I don't think it's something we can really ignore, given the priority it's given across many policy makers, such as, you know, the UK government, the Irish government, UCRI, the UK funders, and so forth. There's lots of reasons why we've got to have a strategic response. And I would just like I think to finish in a moment, just to say, maybe there's quite a lot of different ways we can respond to AI, different ways of upskilling, study what's happening across the sector, align to what's happening elsewhere in the institution, talk to system suppliers. There's lots of ways we can think about this. And before I close, say we've written a blog about how libraries can strategically respond to AI that you might want to look at. The IFLA SIG on AI has got a list of resources about AI as well that might be useful to you. And I'm sure we'll share the slides after. So many of the slides we haven't talked to, and you can also access. So I shall now cease.
Andrew, for like what is a very balanced talk. In a way, I think, you know, AI just has a real dilemma for a lot of us as information professionals. If you have questions, folks, you can just put them in the Q&A and we'll come to answer them afterwards. I know in terms of time as well, I will now introduce Frances and let her speak. But thank you, Andrew. That was really a lot of food for thought. That was excellent. Frances, I'd like to introduce next speaker is Frances Madden. She's Assistant Head of Library Services and Research Services at TU Dublin. Well-travelled, or certainly in London, has worked in the British Library, King's College London, and the Royal Holloway University. And Frances is going to talk, I guess, in kind of the practical side of things in terms of the impact of AI on library research services.
Thanks, James. Okay, I'm doing my screen sharing here. Hopefully you can see that. Shout, and you've got hopefully the right screen as well. Great, thanks. So thanks everyone for having me today. As James said, I'm Frances Madden from TU Dublin, and I am going to be talking about sort of the practical implications of this in terms of my role, and it's quite a personal talk, I suppose. Just to give a bit of background about who I am beyond the several places I've worked. I am not an AI expert by any means, and you know, I think a lot of people have said that already today. I'm an archivist by training, and I came to this post via research data management and done some work with persistent identifiers and project management and things, but I have no programming experience or no carpentry's qualifications either. But I am interested in new technologies, and in my role at TU Dublin, I only started in October last year. I'm developing an expanded research service with a team, so you know, looking after the repository, research data management, support with literature searching, literature review, all systematic reviews, all that sort of thing. And as part of that, I've been reflecting a lot around the services that we offer, and you know, doing that within a newly formed university, looking to the future and all that. You know, I really do think that the title of this webinar today is very apt. You know, we do need to talk about AI and think about how these subjects relate to our community, in this case, or in my case anyway, researchers and mostly postgraduate students, really, from my perspective. And you know, it was really interesting hearing Andrew talking and giving all that sort of really useful background and stuff around this. So I think I probably have a little bit of repetition in here, but you know, give you my take anyway. And I suppose the things I'm thinking about in my role are, you know, one thing that can AI help me do my job and my team do our jobs more quickly and efficiently? Will it change how our jobs work and what we do? On the sort of information literacy piece, you know, what do we need to know to help the researchers we work with do their jobs? And what training do we need to give students to help them navigate this landscape as it is evolving so rapidly? So again, Andrew touched on this as well already, but I suppose one of the things I come to realize is that we're already here. You know, these changes are already here. This isn't something that's in the future that, you know, is going to happen very soon. It's like it is happening. And I suppose I am talking about this from the point of view, that sort of broader definition of AI and machine learning, rather than just these kind of large ChatGPT and large language models, but that there are so many new tools that have some sort of AI component to them. And, you know, just from a kind of researcher's perspective, so, you know, some things that are already quite embedded are things like transcription tools. So there's a tool called Otter where you upload an audio file and it generates the transcript pretty much automatically, instantaneously. As Andrew already alluded to, it helps if you have an American accent, it's much more accurate. But you know, it still does a really good job and saves a lot of time compared to typing out an audio transcript yourself. Then there are all sort of more emerging things would be things like a tool called Elicit, which purports to automate research workflows. At the moment, they're focused on literature review and increasing the speed with which you can generate one. There's also something, Research Rabbit, which has the tagline Spotify for Papers, which is very much focused on the recommendation model and the algorithm used to recommend relevant research. So you sort of tell it what you're interested in and it comes up with really good recommendations. There's also something called Cite, which describes itself as ChatGPT for science. So it has a couple of components, but one of which is a kind of ChatGPT model type of thing, but it includes citations in its responses. It also does a sort of citation analysis piece around whether a citation within a work was, within a citation within an article, whether it was a positive or a negative citation or something neutral. There are also, an array of summary tools. So, they'll take in an academic article and summarize it. And, these are often talked about now in terms of lowering the barrier for people, who may, particularly people where English isn't their native language, to make academic research more accessible to them. And then you also have writing tools. Again, there's a thing called PaperPal, which will, much like that sort of predictive text that you might have within your email, it'll do, and as you write your paper, it'll come up with things and come up with suggestions on the language. And then the other thing I suppose to bear in mind as well is that whether you choose to, you may not have much choice in interacting with some AI tools. So there are things like Wiley has developed a thing called Rex, which is used in the journal submission process. So, if a researcher is submitting an article, they will interact with this tool that has an AI component to it. And I mean, it automatically extracts the information from the file that you've uploaded. So it saves you double keying the information. So, it'll take out all the, you upload a PDF and or a Word document, and it will take out the author's names from it and automatically populate that. We also then have these article integrity checkers, sort of looking at, how the methods of a paper might be structured, and then, or, this, so SciScore does that, and then repetitive review is another thing that publishers can use, and they also advertise to academic institutions, but around looking at, how the policy adherence and things like that as well, and checking the integrity of articles. There are also tools out there, which I must say I haven't used personally, but in a way they are kind of appealing to me in some ways around, things that will write Excel formula for you, or write some code, or write SQL queries. And I suppose, to me, rather than going off and Googling how to, reminding myself, how do I write this particular formula in Excel, something that would just write it for me. But I think you would obviously need to be check it and validate and make sure it was right as well. But, these tools are available. And, people are using them, and, we might come across people who are using them and need to help them out. Again, the whole policy piece as well, I think a lot of this is a response to things like ChatGPT and the concept, particularly in the publishing world, around the concept of an AI tool as an author and whether or not that is valid. And so the Coalition on Publication Ethics produced a position statement on this, and said that AI should not be listed as an author. Various journals have come up with different policies that have slight nuances within, differences of nuance within them. Very recently, I saw a paper come out that was talking about, it was only published last week, but it was looking at, whether, where do we draw the line in this? When you look at, if you're being asked to cite all of these different AI tools, how do you, where does that stop and start? Particularly if you're looking at things like, these sort of suggestion things, like the PaperPal tool, or, these suggestions, how do we draw that line? I think that's a question and needs to be addressed. There's also, been a lot of discussion on copyright issues, particularly with regard to the training data that's used in these models. So there's, quite a lot of litigation going on around that. Just, I suppose, to highlight as well that this is kind of coming at us from all sides as well. There has, in the UK, there was some work done around the use of AI in research assessment. I mean, I think the conclusion of it was like, not quite yet, but maybe we should look at it as a pilot in terms of for the next research excellence framework exercise. They take place every 6 or 7 years. But this is coming, it is being used and explored in a lot of different sectors. So from my perspective, what do we need to think about in the library? And I think one thing we need to try and understand and get our heads around is, how do these tools actually work? And and there is a really big issue, like with my, I'm sort of responsible for open research within the library, and with my open research hat on, there's big issues around not understanding how these work and not being able to understand how these tools work, because the data isn't open and the models haven't been released publicly. So we, it's hard to understand exactly what's going on under the hood. But there are some things we can do. So these large language models, the Coalition on Publication Ethics have this phrase here. But this idea that the ChatGPT and stuff, the way they're working is around predicting what the most likely next word is, and what that means is that you produce sort of plausible text, but that isn't necessarily correct. I think I like to use the term that it hallucinates stuff. So there is potential for incorrect information to be published, but we need to think about can we trust if we are going to use a particular tool, can we trust the tool in that context that we are using them? Can we trust the information that it is producing? When is it appropriate to use these tools? They can be helpful in certain contexts, but they can also, be harmful or hinder the work that we're trying to do. And then, of course, an internal librarian question about referencing. How do we reference how we use these? And, as we said, we've got some guidance around that already. But, again, some of these, I don't think there's any like real broad consensus yet about how these should be referenced. And there is potential that things are not being referenced correctly, but I think some of these companies as well, ChatGPT are working on a watermark for stuff that's generated by it as well. So there are lots of people working on developing this. So I think the overall question then is, how do we communicate with users of AI-based tools about their opportunities and limitations? And we just need to think about this, and we can help our users use them better. I don't think it's particularly constructive to just say, no, don't use these things at all. They're not helpful. We need to work with our users, I think, and sort of meet them halfway. And I think librarians are very well placed to do that. We have a lot of these skills already. It's applying it to a new sector, but we do know how to talk to researchers, and we're also very used to assessing different resources, understanding how they work, and advising how they should be used. So, quite traditional librarian skills around, which database is appropriate for the research question that you have, how do you use them best. Then, as we go down here, these are all things that we've learned, librarians have learned to do within, say, the last 20 years maybe. So things like what research metric should be used appropriately in a given scenario. So when are certain metrics are more appropriate in different contexts, and we can give advice on that. Also things like what you need to consider when you're submitting to a journal. Which journal do you choose? All those sorts of questions. We're within the sort of research support area, we've become very used to that sort of thing. Again, with research data management, what do you need to consider when you're collecting research data? There's data protection issues, storage, etc. As people are writing data management plans, we've got used to dealing with these things. We now have this skill set around addressing these questions. And I think we probably need to develop the same sort of skill sets and knowledge within this within the area of AI. So current awareness, I think, is really key. Finally, just a question I sort of put up earlier around AI and our library work. Could it help me and my team? And I think potentially could. I haven't seen any exact tools yet that I could use or would consider, but I think there is potential for automating manual tasks, for example, data entry, helping to validate records. I mean, I bolded help there because I think, it is definitely at this stage help, not completely do from end to end, probably. Could potentially work with deduplication. I think as well, there are a lot of tools out there that do this already, not necessarily with the AI component, there's sort of automation techniques, but, there is potentially room here for improvement. Potentially they could assist in review of documents and looking at some of those tools that look at, say, they'll review your method section and give you a score of how good it is. There is potential for that type of thing to be incorporated into library workflows. Potentially. I mean, I'm not sure you could completely remove the human from it at this stage, but there is some potential there, definitely. What I heard recently that I thought was quite interesting was the idea of using ChatGPT or something to create dummy data. So, for example, if you needed something for teaching or to test out a new tool, you could get some dummy data created quite easily. And, I mean, it would have obviously, potential for biases and stuff. But again, this is looking at, when it's something appropriate to use. And, there are occasions where it might be. Also, another thing I heard really recently was looking at the potential of AI around improving accessibility of materials. So things like those transcription tools that I was talking about earlier, I've used them personally to generate subtitles on videos of webinars such as this. So they can be very, very useful to improve accessibility, and you'll potentially generate alternative text for images and things like that. So there definitely is a lot of potential there, but a lot of questions still as well remain to be answered. So I will stop there and just want to say thank you.
Thank you, Frances. That was brilliant. I know you'd said, Frances, by the way, it started like this whole thing of not being an expert on the subject, and maybe that's a question for all of us, because the whole idea of expertise, you want to be authoritative on something that, and yet it feels like, when you were mentioning some of the new tools that are out there. I mean, I came across a whole bunch of them the other day, that from GLASP and SciSpace, and I think you mentioned some of them, Fireflies and prompt boxes, a whole load of them. And whether any of these last or not, it feels a bit like the Wild West, and that it's just as open plain and everyone's going to kind of fill it. And some of these companies who will have a commercial interest will survive, and some won't, or some will last, a short period. But I think from a library perspective, for a lot of us is, do we put a page on a LibGuide with, some guidelines for our students and staff, for something that at the same time we're trying to understand ourselves at this stage. So, so that was really refreshing to know that, like, we're all in the same boat in that way, trying to figure this out, and how these tools can actually work in a positive way for us. And, the dilemma, I guess, is, do we engage or do we not engage, and what the perils of those things are in many respects. But thank you again for the talk and for your time as well. If people do have, as I said, questions, if you can put them into the Q&A, would be fantastic. And again, if you're specifically for Andrew or for Frances, then please kind of just mention that in the question as well. Without further ado, I'm going to hand you all over to Thomas Lancaster, Thomas is our final speaker, and then we'll have the Q&A. Where are my notes for Thomas? Thomas Langster so he said he's the only non-librarian. Well, I'm sure there's other non-librarians. I guess like an honorary librarian in many respects, Thomas, but a senior teaching fellow in computer science at the Imperial College London. And Thomas is going to talk about the challenges to education caused by generative AI. And when I say that, I mean artificial intelligence and not academic integrity. Get those two mixed up. Fantastic to meet you, Thomas, and looking forward to your talk.
Yep, thank you very much, James. And yes, you are quite right, because I do a lot of talks about academic integrity as a research area, and people like to abbreviate that to AI. Now, I'm a computer scientist, so I've never really thought of academic integrity as AI. I've always thought of artificial intelligence as AI, because for the reasons that the others have mentioned, then AI is not brand new. It has been with us for a few years now. Been with us for many years in different ways, and it's one of these terms we've all heard. But my brief today is to say a bit about AI within the context of academic integrity, which is really what I'm going to do. Let me just see, Zoom has moved things into very awkward places, but I presume you have my screen and everything available for you now there. But my colleagues have also very kindly covered many of the things I planned to talk about as we went through, because it's so hard just to talk about one topic when there are so many exciting things to say about this area, because I could, like many people, talk for hours about this. So please indulge me if I recap things, and also more than happy to leave time for questions as we go through. But to give you a bit of background about myself, as I mentioned, I do a lot of talks recently about artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, academic integrity and related areas. I'm not a librarian. I'm a computer scientist, but I am much more in the softer side of computer science, more in the ethics side and the more general side, as opposed to somebody who goes ahead and creates these systems. Now, being at a research intensive university, I have lots of colleagues who are out there trying to make AI systems better and faster and more efficient and more explainable. And they think nothing about the concerns about world domination by AI systems that may be out there. If you do want to follow me on Twitter, incidentally, at Dr. Lancaster, you may feel absolutely free to tweet things if you feel so inclined as I speak. And as we go through for that, and of course I will share the slides later on as well. But yeah, I'm particularly interested in using these tools, because to me, you can do things like generate images. You don't have to pay for apps from app stores to go and create things for you. Now, of course, there is an immediate question about what is real and what's fake as soon as you see images, because I look far better looking in generated images than I ever do in real life for that. I'm probably better dressed as well, but there you go. That's what AI does. Now, I've been researching this field now of academic integrity for 23 years, since I was at London South Bank University doing my PhD, but I'm best known not for work in artificial intelligence, but for work on contract cheating. Contract cheating, where a student pays somebody else to do their work for them, or they use somebody else. It could be friends, family members, generally for the purposes of completing assessment and getting an academic award that they don't deserve. And you'll see plenty of machine-generated images as we go through. I just added this slide slightly before the start of today's presentation. So this is a very quickly generated evil teddy bear who's trying to do something, as opposed to whatever I think I started to generate. But these systems are not always completely foolproof. But contract cheating, we may think, okay, this is a solved problem. We may think it is still a problem. There are third parties involved in the process that we can never verify. But one thing we have done surrounding contract cheating, a term that Robert Clark and I introduced in 2006, is we've seen a lot of guidance go out to the sector. This is an example of the UK guidance from the Quality Assurance Agency. I know there's similar guidance from QQI, who've done a lot of work in Ireland about this as well. But universities now have generally addressed this in their policy documents. They've thought about the type of assessments they're going to set for students, how they're going to perhaps look for signs of contract cheating as they mark. Perhaps libraries, I mean, librarians are often the people who do the talks about plagiarism and contract cheating, have thought about what to do in their own environment as well. And one good thing I can say is that a lot of the interventions we put in place surrounding contract cheating also work for the misuse of artificial intelligence. So things like looking for work that isn't written in the style of a student is equally valid if it's written by a third party as if it is written by a machine, without trying to stretch the definition of contract cheating further than perhaps it needs to go. Things we've talked about earlier on in this session, like the fact that references may be invalid or incorrect for contract cheating, because contract cheating writers who are paid by the word and have to turn things out very quickly, believe it or not, have been known to fake references, and they're also valid for the misuse of generative artificial intelligence. So we have some very good guidance as a starting point to work from before we think, though, about perhaps the mass availability of systems that can be misused through artificial intelligence and ChatGPT. So what is generative artificial intelligence? And here is a very high level description, hopefully aimed towards librarians, about things you might want to know about. That it can generate new unique content, like book summaries, because that's what librarians do, of course, and reading suggestions. It can try and mimic real world data, e.g. the structure of language. I tend to say it's following patterns rather than following any real form of intelligence. You could use it in libraries to create personalized content and recommendations. There, use it in teaching and learning as well for personalized learning, and all kinds of ethical issues, including false information, misuse of information. There, bias in the data set. We've talked about many of these again earlier on in the session. Now, I say this isn't my description because really this isn't. This is a description that has come through ChatGPT, because I don't think we've seen much of ChatGPT today in terms of screenshots, even though I suspect everyone here has at least tried this out and used this. So if I was to ask ChatGPT a question, what is generative AI? Explain in short bullet points in a way that's suitable for librarians, then these are the bullet points that I got back. And if I ask this same question 10 times, I could get 10 different sets of bullet points back, because generative AI is not completely predictable. There is a certain amount of randomization in the answers, which is how sometimes you get very correct information and very wrong information. But these are the kind of things you see. Sometimes they're more different than others. But to me, a little bit too much information there for what we would need for the purpose of helping to make sure that librarians have the skills to support other people in this. So what do we do at this point? We ask something like, simplify this and reduce it to 4 bullet points. And I say 4 purely because they fit nicely on a slide for this one. And it does a bit better job, but it's lost the focus towards librarians here by doing this, because although ChatGPT has a form of memory in that it has access to previous parts of a chat there, then it still doesn't always get things right in the way what I think. And so the whole skill here about writing the prompts and directing things, and you can just keep asking more questions, or you can just reset the chat and start again. So there's nothing wrong with that information. I just think it could be more focused for a particular audience there. So one more go, and I got the bullet points I used on the first slide. So they're not the same bullet points I would necessarily write by hand, which is why I talked around them, because those of you who've been out there and you try and deliver someone else's slides or talks or points, then incredibly difficult really, because you never make the because we never know what to bring up. We all have our own personalized examples there, but the information is generally fine. And if we were to ask this question, write this description aimed at people from a different discipline, we may be able to get something quite useful for that discipline. And so there's this big option of time saving if we think it's ethical to do this as part of the process. Now, I've been very upfront. I'm saying that I'm using AI. Not everyone does. And this is where the challenges with academic integrity come in as part of the process. But we perhaps take away from this that this technology is not necessarily as easy to use as you might think. The interface is easy. So the apparent way of communicating with it is easy, but the way to get good results out and to understand the quality of the output is not that easy. And that's where students often need help. That's where academics sometimes need help. And I guess I should say I'm using ChatGPT for examples here. ChatGPT, of course, is far from the only tool in this space. It's just the one that's got all the media publicity, and it's the one that is often available. It's not always available for students. It can go down quite often when it's overused. I could find specialist systems purely for doing academic work. I could find systems I could interact with a computer programmer as well and do a lot more than I can through ChatGPT because I have enough of a programming knowledge to direct it in a certain way. So I have systems out there that I can run and generate 100 different essays if I want, which are variants on a theme. And according to similarity detection tools, such as Turnitin, they look quite different and quite original. So there are various things that people can do if they're smart about this there. So generative artificial intelligence, I've sort of said this already, but I just want to stress, despite this word intelligence, this is not intelligent in the way that a human is intelligent. It is a system that is mimicking patterns. It has access to millions of words of data, some words very reliable, some historical words, some that have probably been grabbed illegally from copyrighted information, so it can recreate the contents of Harry Potter, whatever it might be. And when we use a system like ChatGPT, it just follows prompts and directions there. But when people say AI, we are not thinking about a brain behind these systems in any form there. So there are all kinds of dangers. And from an academic integrity point of view, we want to know that students are learning and we want to know that they're benefiting from the learning. We don't want them to get an unfair advantage over other students. We don't want them to misrepresent their knowledge when they go to apply for jobs or move into the workplace. So the danger of the misuse of AI, a student using AI to do their assignments when it's not allowed, is they just don't learn. They can't do later assignments because they haven't learned the foundational skills. They can't evaluate the quality of information that is provided. So they can't tell you if the information is correct or not because they don't know what they're looking for. And these are the kind of things that we have to deal with as academics, that librarians will have to deal with when students present incorrect information to them, asking, where did that information come from? Why do you think this is correct? Why has it stood out to me as a librarian that this is wrong, but not stood out to you as somebody who's probably more of a subject expert in this area than I am? And there's some underlying foundational questions to think about there. Now, of course, if students breach academic integrity, this may well go through a formal university process. It may well end up with a student being excluded from a university or having to repeat modules, having to repeat years, spending a large amount of money they wouldn't have to do as a result of the consequences of having to stay out of the workplace for an extra year for that. So we want to try and avoid this wherever possible there. So there are all these many dangers to society. There are dangers of people going into jobs and relying on AI as well. And it may be appropriate in some situations if a company authorizes it and allows this to work more efficiently, but not otherwise. I think I have a bit of an advantage with working with AI as a computer scientist because it's very logical, that it relies on having ability to structure a discussion or a series of steps to get the best results out, which essentially is computer programming. Computer programming is following algorithms and logical steps, but other people can learn this to a certain extent. We get people at schools using generative AI to do their homework after all, so you can get superficial type output out quite well. But these are one of the type of skills we have to think about that are perhaps not the most natural for everyone. And I guess the other skills to think about, which I've mentioned already, are the ones surrounding evaluation and critique. That's the higher level skills anyway in Bloom's taxonomy, but these are the ones that we want students to have, that they can check the output and they can say, is this correct? What's the benefit of using this output as opposed to going to an academic research paper or going to a textbook where there have been a lot more checks in place? If a student wants to reference this information, that's fine. I'm not going to go too far into the mechanics of referencing. There are various guides. How do you reference AI generated information, which completely miss the point that generally a student thinks they will generate a whole assignment and reference that, whereas we think they may want to cite 2 or 3 sentences generated by AI. And that's very different to using AI as a tool to using it to replace themselves there. Of course, as soon as they say, well, we want to reference 2 sentences, then I still say, well, why don't you go back and find a definitive tried and tested source? Because that's going to add more value to your work as a result there. But this is evaluation and critique of the skills we quite often need for here. So our limitations in terms of academic integrity for these, and I'm thinking particularly regarding to ChatGPT here, currency of information. You can only easily get information up to a couple of years ago, essentially, from ChatGPT. It thinks the pandemic is ongoing in many cases because of how it's been trained, but you can get around this because there are things like plugins for ChatGPT. If you pay for the $20 plus tax subscription a month, where you can ask it to access external websites, or you can provide the information as part of the prompt. So I say limited if you just want a completely shortcut learning, but there are ways around it. You can get very formulaic responses. You may notice things like a response that it nearly always makes a series of points, then ends with a summary section, which recaps everything that's been said before. And after a while, you start to be able to spot these when you read things. But if you're smart, you can ask for things to be written in a different style, or you can do something subsequent with this. Not terribly good with numbers and maths because it is a language model, word model, not a number model. But again, you can get around that. Again, some disciplines is more of an issue than others. And then the big one is it makes up sources in many situations there. So it's invented many brilliant looking research papers that I've allegedly written and probably wish I had, but I haven't. You get it to write a biography about yourself and it will say some interesting things for that, depending how unique your name is or what kind of prompts you give it for that. But again, there are ways you can sort of say, well, go ahead and interface with Google Scholar nowadays that students don't tend to know. So we should not rely on limitations being there for the long term because they will go away. So there are all kinds of challenges, and I want to keep saying misuse of AI because AI can be used in very good ways. And I've had many chats with students. I do research alongside students. I chaired a panel of students recently talking about this. And the students keep saying they're using ChatGPT for very positive things, depending on your interpretation. They mention things like learning. You don't understand a lecture, so you're going to get a different explanation out using ChatGPT of the same material. You may get it to give you the explanation at your level. In fact, I've seen students in classes I've been in with ChatGPT open, and I'm assuming they are looking for more information about something I'm talking about because they didn't have an assignment at the time for this. But there is the option of using this to learn there. And perhaps it is just the same as we might have said in previous years. Well, here is a textbook, here's a research paper, or here is a YouTube video. Go away and learn from that. Just another source of learning if used in the right way. Use it for ideas. Computer scientist, I'm not particularly creative, get some great creative ideas for things, but don't misuse this to do the work for you. Editing, perhaps more controversial. What would you do if a student uses Grammarly to proofread and remove obvious errors and flaws from their work? They're probably acceptable in many situations, depending how it's used. But what about if this is used to, what about if we ask ChatGPT, go ahead and read something I wrote and suggest improvements? Probably okay. Go ahead and read something I wrote and improve the language and get rid of the errors. There's a point when it becomes too written by a machine that it no longer looks like it's written by a human. And there are all kinds of challenges there in terms of things like machine detection that can come in. I've had students saying, I write my work in a language and I translate it to English. And previously they might have used Google Translate. Now they're using ChatGPT. Is that acceptable? Difficult area, many considerations there. And of course, there's the whole time saving side of things. Little things like I've got a lecture here. I've got the transcript of the lecture. I want to revise, or I was ill. Can ChatGPT summarize the main points from the transcript? And there are examples of students posting online. They've done that to take a 20-hour course and summarize it into a couple of hours of material and got good marks in exams by doing that, which of course raises other questions about how much fluff is there in many lectures that really is unnecessary information, or how much surface learning do we encourage through this approach. But there are advantages. I've done this myself, incidentally, to give students summaries of my lectures there, and got ChatGPT to pull out some of the main ideas, which I think is a useful way of using it for learning. But academic integrity comes into all of these, and I've sort of overlapped that a bit, so I won't go too much through that, but they can all be misused if this is done without the acceptance and authorization of a university there, or if it's done with the intention of a student not learning and doing any work for themselves. So these big picture discussions that we have to have. Just the final 2 or 3 slides. You can of course generate memes using generative AI, generate the pictures, use the get it to generate the meme text to go on the top. For that, I say creativity. Many of these are funnier than I would produce for myself for that, although this particular one is very bad at putting the meme over somebody's face. But at least this person looks to have 5 fingers, even if I'm not sure they have any thumbs, which generative AI does not always manage to get hands completely correct for that. That's why you see so many people generating pictures of people wearing gloves or with the hands hidden away below their desk or something like that to avoid this. But more seriously, what kind of things do librarians need to know? And I'm not a librarian, so although I talk a lot to our faculty librarians and people like this, these are discussions for you to have about the guidance. But I really think you need to know what the policy is in your institution, bearing in mind that policies are changing and developing all the time. Some universities had very quick draconian policies which said generative AI is completely banned. Completely impossible to enforce, so it's not particularly helpful, and it's not how the world is going to work in the future, and I suspect that will change. But all these policies are very agile as things change, as we see that Google Docs has introduced its own text generation and rewriting service within Google Docs that is being rolled out, or we talk about things like earlier Microsoft Office Copilot, which will have this technology in Office. It's going to be very hard to differentiate between when you're doing something yourself, when you're relying on an industry standard tool to work with. I think as librarians, one thing that's come up in discussions I've had with other people and the networks that I'm part of in this, because I do quite a lot more than introduction probably suggested in this area, is what happens if a student goes to you as a librarian and they ask you for a research paper that they've found using ChatGPT that doesn't exist? How do you respond to that there? Because obviously you can't give them the paper unless you decide you're going to generate it yourself and try and fake them out, which I don't recommend. Is this then an attempt at violating academic integrity? They have to progress. Is this a learning opportunity where you help the students to work better with this technology, or to find the correct ways of accessing information and finding sources? What do you do in this situation for that? There is a reference in question I brought up a bit earlier on as well, but there's a whole wider idea that perhaps people will be sat in the library using these tools, and what do you do to support and help them there? So all I can say, just to conclude before we go over the exciting bit, which is the questions, is we don't have all the answers. We do have people who are going to go into the world of work. You notice this lady, I've managed to hide her hands away from there. I'm not convinced the building will stay up in the background, but there's another problem with the misuse of potential technology and how much people learn as part of this process. But students are going to need these tools, are going to work with them in the future. They're going to be arriving from schools with different skills very soon because they may have used or misused tools before coming to university as well. How do we make sure they have the right skills? And when I say everyone, academic integrity is for everyone. What do we do to support the staff as well? Academic staff, professional services staff, other librarians, employers, because we can't assume everybody has this knowledge automatically, or they understand these things. There are still people who think that they're going to wake up in a few days' time and generative AI and ChatGPT will have gone away. I'm really not convinced that is the case. We are in a fast pace of change in the world at the moment there, and this technology is here to stay. It's going to be a massive part of education going forward. Many positive reasons for having this we've talked about earlier. So to me, it's a great change. It is just fast, and that is where the challenge lies for that. So at that point, thank you very much for attention. I hope I've given you a few ideas. I see lots of interesting questions. Do feel free, as I mentioned, to connect with me. Twitter at Dr. Lancaster there, and hand over back to James.
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, fantastic. And it's hard to know where to pick up. There was loads of points, and I'm going to go look at the questions, but just a comment from myself, because I had bumped into an academic staff from my university recently. Funnily enough, in the freezer aisle in Tesco, which I wouldn't recommend standing for too long in that place. But we were talking about ChatGPT, and he was saying, well, wouldn't it be great if it could translate or tidy up the English of some of our students? And I'm thinking, actually, these things do exist. And interesting that an academic staff probably doesn't know about it. The students will source these things, and then the question is whether they're being used in an ethical way, or they actually kind of tools and products that are not there just to kind of exploit the kind of commercial use of these students. And but yeah, loads to think about. And as you said, there's lots of challenges. The other thing that really hit me there was around the whole thing of this blandness or formalistic kind of approach to kind of to what is put out there, and actually that human experience may become more valued, I hope, in the future, or be easier to kind of to identify. So I'm going to look in at the questions. Thank you, good, blah, 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 as a consult. Let me just find out, because wherever it goes. So there was one, let me see here. Answered. Right, one here from Sarah says, question maybe best place for Francis. If you were to use AI to transcribe and summarize an oral history interview, for example, are we running into data protection issues by allowing the recording to be accessed by the AI platform database?
So maybe was the answer I came down on there. Like it could be. I was really interested to see that Andrew said that Sheffield have come up with some recommended tools, because I think the issue could be, or depending on the tool you're using, they may have terms and conditions that could cause data protection issues. But equally, I haven't looked into this in depth. There might be tools out there that are okay. You could also capture it at the consent process as well, that you're going to be using this if you were conducting the interviews. But if you're transcribing something that was recorded 5 years ago, you'll have that problem. That wouldn't help out that problem.
Okay, thanks, Francis. And that question was from Sarah. I have another one. It's from an anonymous attendee. He says, I'm really starting to think about AI.
James, Andrew wanted to come in there.
Oh, did he? Sorry, I missed it. Sorry, just my screen. I didn't see it there. Sorry, Andrew, go ahead.
No problem. I just wanted to chip in and say, researchers are asking the same question. You might get them because they're doing interviews. They want transcription was always the most boring part of doing interview-based research. So transcription tools could be really valuable. And Sheffield, as I mentioned, Sheffield's recently approved 2 tools. I assume that they got a particular license arrangement, because as Francis said, you can't just let the data disappear into wherever, and you could pop up and be reused for training. You don't know where it's going, so it's got to be probably checked out.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm going to move on to another question. It's an anonymous attendee. It says, I'm really starting to think that AI to fight predatory publishing should be first point of call for a development. as research integrity needs to be secured before we let Siri-like AI answer clinical questions or make evidence synthesis in medical libraries. And probably only a matter of time before we enter that area. Is there any development in AI being able to fight predatory publishing in terms of lacking peer reviewing or mixing solid research with poor research, for example? Predatory publishing, anyone jump in? Or
Just
I
going
think James
say,
that Francis had
Yep.
mentioned there about she has a link there for a blog. Do you want to answer that, Francis?
yeah, just that. Yeah, publishers are looking at this quite a lot and investing in. So I think that blog lists quite a lot of steps that they're taking, and they're sort of working together to try and stop things. So they're investing in it quite heavily. Yeah, Andrew or Thomas might know more about those activities as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, I mean, the whole research integrity is a massive area. It's sort of parallel to academic integrity, but I don't focus on that area like some people would do. But we're definitely seeing people out there getting papers sort of mass produced using GPT technology and submitting them for review. And there are so many publishers that will take them if you pay your fee. Or if you're just in a country where you need to inflate your citation count or something like that, that will get through the system. So I think there's going to be a massive area for librarians about evaluating the quality of published academic papers that go through this process as well. There now, some of the more reputable publishers are going to be doing various checks. I don't rely. AI detection software is completely unreliable. I don't recommend you use it for student work, and I don't recommend it's used for research work either, particularly because a lot of researchers are going to be trained to write in a very formulaic style, which is like the style that AI writes to some extent, constant sentence lengths, certain types of wording, etc. for that. But of course, researchers have more right to reply than students if they are falsely accused of using AI. But the kind of things we are seeing out there, and it was mentioned earlier on about you can use ChatGPT and AI to create dummy data. You can, of course, use it to create dummy data, which you pretend is real and use the basis for a research paper. So there are all kinds of ways you can misuse this. And then the question becomes, okay, how far can you declare this in a research paper and say this is a simulation or this is a demonstration of a method and becomes acceptable? Whereas at what point is this unpublishable? Or at what point do we change our definition of what constitutes a valid academic research? It's actually the sort of a discussion I'm having, because I've submitted a draft paper to a journal which covers some of these areas of discussion, which is a bit clearly controversial with the reviewers. So it probably will never get published, but people are out there doing this all the time. So it is happening.
thank you, Thomas. Yeah, this is where it just gets a real, not say a muddle, but it's just, I really do feel that we as I said, like in one respect, there's this open plane, and we're going to get caught in the middle in terms of what can you trust and what can you not trust, what's reliable, what's not reliable. So there's just I think there's a lot of an interesting road ahead. And one we need to kind of tread carefully. And I'm just going to, it leads on to the next question, which is, it basically, it's from Hardy Schwam, and thanks, Hardy. It says, how much are we concerned about who owns AI? This is Francis mentioned the issue of trust. Example, the big publishers are all investing in AI, digital science, for example, and we need to ask what data was used to train AI, and who in the library world would understand the answer. In short, do we need to be more critical of library tools using AI than non-AI systems when thinking of using or purchasing them? So again, this whole idea of trust and where do we all stand in terms of what products we use or what tools that we engage with?
I mean, I can pick this up as a massive area of discussion there. There's a part of this is, what is your university agreement for student work? What can you do with this? And there's a question in the chat about detection, which I've covered a little bit. I don't rely on this, but people will just upload their work to random websites that say we detect AI. and we don't know where they're based. We don't know what they're going to do with the documents, whether they're going to share them, like some services online that say we are selling, we give you a free plagiarism check, but then they publish model essays of the student work online a few months later because they claim they have ownership of them. So look at your university agreement. It says service like Turnitin, we probably have an agreement with about what they would do with the data. The students may have agreed the copyright of their work will allow this, but some of these random services that are popping up, even down to OpenAI itself, might not be ones we have a university agreement to share work with that. In terms of the training data, it's definitely a question to ask. How was this generated? In most cases, we will not get an answer that is of any use. There are associated questions, equity type questions, like are we paying for access to services if we're requiring students to use them to make sure there is uptime? Because something like ChatGPT is not always up. If we insist that students use it, but it's down, what happens when they can't submit? Or what happens if they use the free version, which is less powerful than the paid version that other students have access to as well? For this one, for that, there is a question that came in the chat that I'll just briefly address because it often comes up in talks I give to do with students about the environmental impacts. It is a massive discussion because the processing power of running, say, a ChatGPT search is hundreds of times more than running a Google search there. And so we have vast data centers which contributing to global warming, essentially, or climate change, I should say, to use a slightly better term. And yes, some students are concerned. And I suspect we'll see the same students who are protesting about universities investing in fossil fuel or about selling meat on campus because of the environmental damage are going to be protesting about the overuse of AI because for those reasons. So we have to think about how we're going to address that and draw a balance. I didn't raise that particularly today because I don't think that's so much a library type question, but it is definitely a wider question is going to be so important when we become reliant on technology for that one. I probably didn't answer the question. I probably answered a load of other related questions, so apologies, but hopefully got something out of that.
My chip in also to say, yeah, I think there's a danger of seeing there's a proliferation of tools and just evaluating them as tools, like they're free tools. Who cares where they come from and where the data goes? But I think that's quite, and I think how students will think about it is like, well, it's easy to use, it does something for me, I'm not too bothered what's happening behind the scenes or who profits. I think the kind of things Thomas mentioned about environmental impact, maybe the exploitative way, you know, ChatGPT, there's a controversy about how the data was detoxified in an exploitative way. Who's profiting? Do we really want Microsoft and Amazon and Google to run our lives and have this data about us? We're basically, I remember someone saying, we're basically training. We've provided loads of data which they've used to train these things. Now in our use of them, we're also training these tools. It's a hugely exploitative area. We've got to, so I think, and I think to pick up a little bit on what Thomas is saying, is like when we say to students, try and inform students about how to use these things critically, we should be asking them to think about how to use them effectively, make sensible choices of which tool to use. But you're also prompting them to ask those questions about the economics and power behind the system. And that might be something that will put them off using them or make them use them in different ways. And that would be good. So that's perhaps not the most obvious way of looking at these tools, but it's
thank you, Andrew. I don't know if anyone else. I'll move on to a question here because I'm just conscious of the time. We're getting close enough to 1 o'clock. It's a question from Michelle Breen, and this is thanks to all the speakers. And which is, have the panel any examples of leading institutions that have done really good, or dare I say, it's simple AI policies, or even libraries that have taken a lead on AI guidance as it relates to academic integrity, plagiarism, and referencing. So students are ahead of us here as they're already asking.
I mean, I don't think universities move that quickly. In my experience, we all work for them in our experience of universities, and you can't just make these changes. You can put some preliminary guidance and things like that out. I mean, there are certainly some universities I think the guidance is better than others, but there are none that I want to particularly focus in on and say, go ahead and copy this guidance or anything like that. I mean, the students are quite rightly asking these questions, and all we can say is we're working on this, but we can also say we want students involved in the discussion. We want to know their opinions because this is going to affect them in their life. So yeah, so people unfortunately often ask, what about some brilliant assessment briefs that use AI and things like that? And I'm slightly dubious about having assessment briefs that mandate AI, but I would like assessment briefs to clarify what level of AI use is allowed in that assessment, because we have foundational assessments where we don't want students to use AI because they have to have some knowledge to do the rest of the course. But maybe there's a point they reach when it's appropriate for them to use AI in different situations, because that's what happens in the wider authentic world. So it's the kind of things we have to specify. But I hope over the summer, when universities have a bit more time to reflect and to make these changes, then we'll see some very good guidance arriving, but it has to be agile for the future because we're not at an end point yet. We're only at a starting point.
Thanks, Thomas. Anyone else, or I don't know, Francis or Andrew? I'll move on to another question here. I'll come to this question here from Patrick Keegan, but I'm going to come to a question here from Marta Basilio. So Marta's a colleague of mine in UCD Library. Says, is there such a thing as generative AI that protects users' privacy? And if not, what are we doing if we use AI in teaching and ask students to use generative AI in their assignments? Yeah, I mean, this is this whole question around, you know, ChatGPT asking for your phone number to, you know, and you know, whole area of privacy, which is uneasy, I think, for a lot of us, because we're being asked, I think, on one level as well, to engage with it and have a look, and then there's dilemmas around, you know, things like privacy and, you know, the ethical use of this by these companies, by OpenAI and by Microsoft and everyone else.
Yeah, I think we sort of covered that a bit, but you have very little privacy once you're online in general. That is not going to change. You can be tracked. You have cookies following you from site to site to see what you're doing. Now, I believe that OpenAI ChatGPT is a question that came up. Then it says it will not store your requests for the purposes of improving its models, but there are things you can opt into and opt out of. You have to be quite careful about. So, I mean, all these services should have privacy statements, and they're worth checking out. I do foresee a time when perhaps universities will run their local models, their local systems to do this. We're already seeing open source models being trained, but not as powerful as, say, a GPT-4 at the moment, which is used by the more advanced version of ChatGPT. But we will see universities start to offer many of these things locally to avoid these questions of privacy. But students will still prefer to go to the world leaders, just as they do with other types of software.
Thank you, Thomas. So I just forgot to say, Thomas, so just say thank you. That's a really good point, just in the previous one around students as kind of stakeholders and be involved in the discussion. I think, you know, maybe maybe this is one of the things for libraries is that we, you know, when we give guidance, we want to be authoritative, but actually, you know, as I said, maybe the students have more of an insight to some of these tools and some of the, you know, than we have, and to have them in that discussion is a really kind of valid point. I'm just going to try and get through a few of these questions. There's a question here from Patrick Keegan. Says, any thoughts on the accuracy of AI filters and detection? Turnitin, for example, have recently upgraded their system to have an AI index.
I should let someone else answer, but Turnitin, I believe, have themselves said recently that this isn't always as accurate as you might think in some situations. So I don't know. I mean, there's probably 50 of these different detection tools floating around now. of which Turnitin is the one that universities are most likely to have a subscription for already for that. But they've all got metrics saying how successful they are, but it's never, so they might say something like, oh, we get it right 95% of the time. That still means by their estimation, they get it wrong 5% of the time. And there's always a bit of a dubious nature about how these metrics are calculated, because we never know exactly what they're testing for. And a very common example is they have been trained to detect text generated using GPT-3, but people now are using GPT 3.5 or GPT-4, which is less formulaic, and therefore you'd expect the detection to be less accurate for that. So although these things may change, at the moment, I would not rely on this, because you will falsely accuse students. And indeed, a lot of universities have blocked the Turnitin AI option from their local systems, so staff can't use it precisely for that reason. Now, it doesn't mean that perhaps these things are, maybe they have a use as a talking point, but I don't think they have a use as a way of starting academic misconduct proceedings against a student at the moment. So there's a lot of work to be done. It was mentioned a bit earlier on about watermarking, which is being worked on, or was announced about 6 months ago by OpenAI. I've just published a paper in the International Journal for Educational Integrity, which talks about watermarking, that went live earlier in the week, although, as with academic publishing, it was written about 6 months ago. This is how long it's taken to get through the process. So I'm not sure I completely think it is all, I would make exactly those same points we're writing this today, but that is the challenge of working in AI. But essentially, I believe it is reasonable that these will embed hidden words and characters and structures to be detected, but at the same time, I think that people can remove these hidden watermarks because they just run it through another tool that then goes and does a bit of paraphrasing to the text or something afterwards. So, and presumably places like OpenAI are going to charge for access to their detection service to see if there's a hidden watermark. So I don't think this is any kind of solution. So I think finding ways to work with the technology is going to be a solution rather than trying to detect things.
Thanks to Thomas, Andrew, or Francis. Have you? No. Okay. I'll move on now. I can just see there's a I think an answer from I think it's S. Ronan. Check for okay. That's an answer to a question from Marta, and another question here from Marta. Can you also foresee a time when staff would be required to use AI productivity tools, and what does that mean in terms of privacy, copyright, authorship, etc.?
When I was talking about this Copilot from Microsoft,
Yeah,
I think, yeah, we will be told that we've got to use these tools. The expectation will be that we're more productive. And that means, okay, before we gave you an hour to prepare a presentation, now you need less time. That will be the expectation. I mean, Microsoft sell it as solving the problems of office work. There are many sort of irritations for office work, like too many meetings, and maybe it will do that. But I think the underlying kind of motive driver is productivity, increasing productivity, and that basically means you've got to do your work quicker to the same standard. So I think there's a lot of potential in the educational. Maybe it won't work out in the education context like that, but I think in some certain work contexts, it will be about driving productivity, and it will mean people just having to work hard and fewer jobs probably. The evidence, I mean, I was reading a couple of papers about this recently, about the impact of using ChatGPT on skills. And what it suggested was everybody gets a bit better at doing their job, but actually it's the people with least skills who benefit most. It was kind of doing things that the very competent worker can do, like, turning a report into a presentation. It's making those skills less valuable, and it's kind of squashing the differential between high-performing workers and low-performing workers. So that's, to me, sounds like a strategy of basically, well, it's a cost cutting is the ultimate driver of a lot of this. Maybe it doesn't touch our sector. I'm not saying it's in the library sector, but if you look at legal work or any office work, that's their target. I think Microsoft's target is to make that more productive. They'll say it, enriching our experience of work. Will that be the reality? I don't know.
Andrew, do you not then think that, I guess, throughout history, the idea of humans making tools is to make, life easier for us, and not saying less productive, but that it should simplify, and we've more leisure time, as opposed to being expected to be more productive. I don't know.
Well, there's both those stories, aren't there? There's a story that AI will leave us to do all the interesting things. And then there's the other story, AI will dominate our work. It'll control how long we're expected to do work, but take away the things we're interested in doing. So the question is, in this case, which is it really going to look like? And the answer is nobody really knows across. Yeah. But we know that it will. The whole point of this whole AI frenzy is to, I suppose, to respond to this kind of agenda that a lot of governments have, is there's a problem with productivity. But is that really going to benefit us? We're drifting off library applications, but I think it's an interesting question.
Yeah, no, that's okay. We're fine to drift off. I am looking at the time and it's just gone 1 o'clock. So, where it's 5 past. So we'll just try and, get through the last few questions. And I think we
James,
have to,
can I jump in on that last,
absolutely,
last question? I know we're coming to a natural end here, but in terms of AI and productivity, or we would be required to use this, it's not just a question for education and universities, it's a question for all businesses there, including the ones our students are going to go into. And I'm sure there are things we will be required to do that use AI. Things like writing emails and replying to things. Think about all the formulaic emails where you write the same thing multiple times, or where you have to write a difficult email, and you can, and I've done this because I'm a senior tutor, I deal with student support and some challenging issues there. And you can at least get a draft. So think of a form of words through ChatGPT, even though I'd never just use it as is and type it into an email reply. So there are benefits there. And things like slides, I don't want ChatGPT writing my slides. I quite enjoy writing slides and the whole process of writing, but there will be things that there's no excuse for, like having poorly laid out slides that aren't readable for people with disabilities and things like that, because it should be possible for AI to pick up on those type of issues there. So there are positive things, but I completely agree. Yes, we're always asked to do more with less, and this is going to be another example. So a lot of this is going to be about thinking about how we're going to work smartly with this technology, not to replace us, but to help to enhance what we can do.
Thank you, Thomas. Yeah, I mean, you're right. I think, maybe a lot of us have also engaged with AI and are not even knowing it, certainly, I had this conversation with my wife where we were saying, well, you're talking about it and saying, well, look, you use predictive text, these things have been around for quite some time. And we do, I guess, we're, consumers at the end of the day, and we're buying products and we're giving away information as well, via through so many different channels. And, someone mentioned Siri as well, and, that we allow these products into our house. This whole area of the Internet of Things as well, of linking everything up as well, and that ultimately, we are engaging with this whether we like it or not. ChatGPT is just is another and maybe 5-10 years down the road, it'll have moved on and ChatGPT will be something else. And I think one fear, I had a discussion with a colleague, a while back, actually, was Marta, who asked these questions, and she mentioned the fear of a monopoly as well. And you mentioned about bias and this idea that ultimately you're going to have a few big players. So that's why Microsoft are really trying to make leaps and bounds to be ahead of their competitors. But, do we end up in a situation where there's only 2 or 3 of the, similar products, and then we're allowing the people who create these to have a complete and utter monopoly and a certain level of bias in terms of the architecture that happens behind these systems? And, and any thoughts on that as such?
Yeah, I definitely think that is where people like Microsoft want to go with it. They want, a lot of people use Office. I suppose a lot of people use Google. These tools will appear within those. So it is a thing that we should be concerned with, as well as, and I think Thomas makes a really good point, like in education, we're teaching people that are going to go on and work in this environment. So actually this discussion about how to use ChatGPT in this case effectively and appropriately is something we should be having with students, because they're going to go into a workplace that is actually buzzing with the same debates. So the idea of just banning it or saying we just can't use it isn't really that relevant. I think we should need to have discussion with students. Like Thomas gave some good examples of how it can be used really effectively. We should be encouraging that. I mean, again, I've been doing a bit of research with colleagues on the writing process. So people use Google Translate. A lot of our international students, they use Google Translate, they use Grammarly. They're already using those AI tools. ChatGPT is just the latest one. It's a jump forward in terms of how much it might do for them. But I think we perhaps in a little bit in denial that is going on, and that we really need to have one of the things we need to go and find out how users are using these things. Isn't that what we should be doing?
Yeah. And I guess then that was a question, because it's just keeping up to date with everything as well. And I know if I take where I work, we're currently undergoing a huge building project. So it feels like everyone's head is turned on upscale or upgrading the physical library. And maybe that's where the idea of the name came, but we need to talk about AI. But we've tried to have this at several staff meetings. Like, can we discuss this? We're too busy talking about everything else, and meanwhile, this is all happening in the background. And I think for a lot of us, maybe just feel a bit overwhelmed at times, because we are meant to be, we're seen as information professionals, and yet maybe we might start lagging behind. I mean, I certainly, like, yesterday I had a really quick look at, let me see what they were called. They were already mentioned there, consensus and illicit. One of them I gave up on because there was a charge for it, and also they're immediately asking for personal information, your mobile number, and so on. So there's barriers in that way of actually being able to look at everything and get an understanding of all this as well. Also, I guess I'm not in the world of necessarily needing a translation product, but I'm sure there are students who do, so they will have a better understanding of these things than potentially we have as well. And we've nearly got through every question. I know there's a little bit of overlap with some questions as well. Also, just say there's a great thank you for everyone who's also given messages that say they really enjoyed the discussion. We hope from the LIR Group to have maybe another one of these seminars, certainly the next couple of months. We have 1 or 2 other speakers as well. We didn't want to have 5 speakers. It just would have been kind of too much to give everyone that kind of chance. But I have a question here from Susan Ball. Says, thanks to all the speakers. Do you think this is just going back to the thing of watermarking, will be enough and broadly adopted commercially? Are there any other identifying solutions you have heard of? Also, have you any thoughts on overcoming the inherent biases in the actual generation of AI and on the possible loss of new originality and creativity in idea generation, learning and culture of generic rather than the unique outputs. Yeah, this is going back to the whole thing of this things being formulistic and
yeah, I mean, there's lots of questions there sort of tied up together for this. Do I think watermarking is a solution? I mentioned this a little bit earlier on, so it depends how we go through this. Ultimately, I don't, because I mean, OpenAI talked about this 6 months ago, and we've heard no more about it because it's an incredibly difficult problem. There was another research paper published which shows that it is theoretically possible to watermark text, but the watermark is an invisible watermark. So essentially what happens is that rather than your text being generated completely randomly, but following a set of rules as it is at the moment, then every so many tokens, which we'll think of them as words or series of characters, then rather that token being random, it's generated according to a rule. And so a detector can then try and find things that follow that rule. But it only works if OpenAI never tell us what that rule is. So they are the only people who essentially hold the keys for detection. Now, it's absolutely fine if you're willing to pay for it and assuming nobody modifies the text that is produced. But as soon as somebody modifies the text, or as soon as they use a different generation system, so they don't use OpenAI or they don't use GPT-4, they use something else, then that style of watermarking no longer becomes useful. So I think there are just too many workarounds and ways to fool the system that it's not going to be a terribly good approach, regardless of how well-intentioned it is. So that's my take on that. Can you make your text more creative? Yes, you can if you use the right prompts and you send the right direction, or if you go into the OpenAI playground, which gives you essentially a lot of variables, a lot of sliders to say how creative do you want the text to be? How much repetition do you want in the text? If you do that rather than using ChatGPT, you can get more interesting output. The higher you set the creativity, then in general, the more likely it is to give you fake information out because it's being creative, it's not being accurate. So there's these kind of balancing points there. But most people never get to those kind of systems, but they are out there. Do these systems remove or enhance creativity? That will depend on your view, because there are certainly creative ideas I could get from a system like this that I would not think of myself. But somebody who's very creative might feel that it's what was said earlier, that this essentially is moving everyone towards the center point where we all have the same skills. So the fact I can write quite well is of less benefit now because other people can write well with the aid of technology. But the fact someone else is more creative is of less benefit to them because I can fake some of that creativity by getting a machine to generate unique combinations of things that I wouldn't necessarily have done for myself. But there's still a human level on top of all this. It's why that I can generate creative looking images, but I don't think of them as art. I just think of them as a combination of pixels which follows a pattern or request. But a real artist can do a huge amount more, even if they're using this technology to enhance their own artwork.
Thank you, Thomas. I know there was also a question about where did you, the image that you had generated earlier, what did you use for it? So maybe there are questions someone can just pop to you in an email. I think it's time to potentially wind up. I think if anyone has from any of our speakers, one, just to say a huge thank you and a round of applause. For me, one thing that struck me is just, if you haven't done it or if you're not doing it in your institution, would be to, so there's a hand raise, I'll come back to that in a second, is to, we have someone working in research, someone working as computer science in the information schools, is for us to just have these discussions within our institutions as well. Is really important because people bring in different, Thomas, you have a whole kind of understanding in terms of being a computer scientist of things that we might know a little bit about, but don't have the same kind of level of understanding. So we're certainly getting a chance to kind of go and speak and pick your brains is really important. There was a hand up there, sorry, just where was it? I can't really see it on this system here. I'm not sure if I can even do that with this technology with Zoom to let a person to speak or unmute them. But look, it's nearly 20 past, and I can see that the numbers have kind of gone from well over 100 down to about 60. So people are either needing to use a toilet or have, you know, something to eat. But just to say thank you, and again, just a huge thank you to all the members of the LIR Group, you know, for their time in terms of getting this up and running. And again, just to our speakers as well for a really fantastic kind of, this is great because this is work for us as well, but it's also hugely enjoyable and really good discussion. I'm going to wind up with just a thought. I'm currently nomadic in terms of my office, and I'm in Blackrock Library in UCD at the moment, and it's nice and quiet. And when I walked in, so I had to drive in and park my car and was walking in, and I saw someone smoking a pipe who looked like an academic. I have to kind of make an assumption, and he was reading. And in a way, I would imagine if you tried to kind of you know, in TV advertisements where they stick a white coat and a stethoscope around someone and suddenly they're a doctor, and maybe that's what they're trying to do with something like ChatGPT. You know, Thomas, you made a really good point saying there's no brain behind it as such. It is a series of patterns and, you know, imitation and mimicry, and that we really need to bring that creative human element really is hugely important in all the work that we from our students, and that what we do ourselves as well, and not to lose sight of that. And yet we also need to embrace and engage with these tools as well. So just to say again, a huge thank you to everyone involved with this this afternoon. And as I say, Thomas and Francis and Andrew are all up on Twitter, and you know, if you have other questions, you know, don't plague them, by the way, but please, you know, kind of good questions would be welcome. Okay, thank you. Right, enjoy lunch, everyone. Take care. Bye.